The day after the European Grand Prix, the world nearly ended. The Soviet Union's missile warning system showed a ballistic missile launch from the US targeted at the USSR, with 4 more launch warnings following. Fortunately for everyone, the duty officer at the command centre, Stanislav Petrov, suspected it was a false alarm and decided to wait for confirmation rather than immediately relay the warning up the chain of command, which would almost certainly have triggered a full-scale nuclear war. Coming at a time of increasing tensions in the Cold War, although Petrov was privately commended, he could never be publicly rewarded as the event was kept strictly under wraps. It was all a very eerie parallel to the movie War Games, released just a couple of months earlier. There was another narrow escape from disaster elsewhere in the Soviet Union on the same day, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, where a Soyuz rocket launch went catastrophically wrong and exploded on the launch pad. The spacecraft's launch escape system triggered 6 seconds before the detonation, saving the 2-man crew. In the UK, following their record defeat in the general election that summer, the Labour Party elected as their new leader Neil Kinnock, the son of a Welsh coal miner who had gained popularity within the party for his eloquent speech-making, particularly when criticising Thatcher's handling of the Falklands crisis the previous year. Kinnock was seen as a centrist with solid left-wing credentials, and his decade as leader would be defined by his struggles with the hard-left Trotskyist militant tendency and his attempts to make the party more broadly popular and media-savvy. So, a dramatic few weeks in the world at large, and there was no little drama in the F1 world too, as the teams headed south to the nearly summer heat of Kyalami. Ferrari had confirmed that Michele Alboreto would be driving for them next year, and that it would be Patrick Tambay who would give way. Unfortunately, the team were unable to get hold of Patrick to tell him, but went ahead and announced it anyway, so the first Tambay heard of it was when an Italian journalist called him for a comment. The Scuderia also reiterated that a third car would be made available for Didier Pironi as and when he felt able to return to the cockpit. Elsewhere, Eddie Cheever would be seeking another drive as he had not had his Renault contract renewed, which seemed a little harsh on poor Eddie, who had done a pretty good job all things considered. With a big question mark still hanging over Riccardo Patrese after a frustrating season, there were rumours that Patrick Tambay might be driving one of the blue and white cars next year. Or maybe Johnny Cecotto. There was still a lot to be decided in terms of lineups for 1984. The main topic of conversation, though, was the various championship permutations. Alain Prost held a wafer-thin 2-point lead at the top of the table, but Nelson Piquet seemed to have the momentum going into the last race after winning the 2 previous events. Nonetheless, if Alain could finish ahead of Nelson, or Nelson didn't finish, he would still become France's first world champion. So could René Arnoux, but it was a much bigger ask. He needed to win, with Prost no higher than 6th, and Piquet no higher than 4th. The constructors' race was less close. Ferrari almost had the title sewn up, and only needed to score 5 points to seal it, but a good result for Renault and a couple of engine failures for the red cars could change all that. Williams had their Honda engines for the first time, and the Japanese manufacturer had decided they could only supply one team at a time, and it would be Williams Honda for 1984 and onwards. Spirit therefore decided to give the race a miss and start the process of finding a new engine supplier. Also absent were the Theodore cars, the team electing to forgo the expensive trip south while they tried to scrape together some sponsorship to continue into 1984. All of which meant that there were just 26 cars for qualifying and everyone was guaranteed a start. The weather was glorious as the teams headed out for qualifying, with the Brabham team in confident mood and the Renault team looking frazzled as they tried to perfect their special issue extra-boosted qualifying engines. Cheever suffered a turbo failure on his, then found the replacement down on horsepower. Prost called his engine nothing special, but at least found the handling perfect. With the paddock in a fractious mood due to repeated efforts by the organisers to clear the narrow pit lane of hangers-on and reposition fuelling rigs, Patrick Tambay made an eloquent statement about his exit from Ferrari by putting his car on pole and then dividing the $3,000 prize money between his mechanics. The Brabhams were 2nd and 3rd, with Arnoux 4th and Prost a fuming 5th in the Renault. Alongside him was Rosberg enjoying his new Honda turbo power, with Lafitte 10th behind Mansell, Winkelhock and De Cesaris. Eddie Cheever was 14th in the other Renault, just ahead of John Watson, who was still not confirmed for 1984 and was widely suspected to be running his last race for McLaren. At the back, meanwhile, Kenny Aitchison would make his Grand Prix debut from 24th place, despite not actually setting a time on Saturday, as the two Ozellas were in all sorts of trouble and were initially set to be excluded from the race for qualifying outside 110% of the pole time, but all the other teams agreed to let them start anyway. The weather was still scorching on Sunday, which spelt bad news for the Goodyear shod teams, notably Williams and Ferrari, whose rubber had proved to be much less effective than Michelin's, McLaren, Brabham and Renault, in hot weather. The cars headed off for the parade lap, but John Watson, already in the spare McLaren after having problems with his own, was left standing before getting a push start and heading off in pursuit of the others. As Winkelhock had done previously, he filtered back up through the field to retake his starting position by the time the grid lined up again. When the green lights came on, Piquet got the perfect start and Tambay was sluggish away and lost second to Patrese too, so it was the two Michelin-tired Brabhams in front of the Goodyear-tired Ferrari as they went into the first corner. Behind them, De Cesaris also had a great start to overtake Prost and slot in behind Tambay. Nelson Piquet had told the media the previous day that his plan was to put the hammer down in the first 10 laps or so and see how his tyres responded, and he certainly did so, pulling out a lead over Patrese, who in turn was beginning to pull away from Tambay. De Cesaris and Prost were running together behind the Ferrari, chased by Rosberg and a rather distant Arnoux. De Cesaris and Prost overtook Tambay in formation on lap 2 as Lafitte's miserable season ended with a spin into the gravel trap. He was joined in retirement the same lap by Ghinzani and Winkelhock, both with engine failures. With Prost still looking for a way past De Cesaris, the BBC cut back to the studio. The season-ending title showdown was being broadcast as part of the sports magazine show Grandstand. While Housewife's Choice Des Lynam was busy reading out the day's racing results or introducing highlights of a First Division football match, Niki Lauda was charging. The Austrian veteran had put in the fastest lap in the morning warm-up and was clearly enjoying his car, making his way up through the field, taking 6th from Rosberg on lap 8 and bearing down on Tambay. Arnoux had had enough already and retired on lap 10, citing an overheating engine and abandoning his already slim title hopes, while Prost finally got past De Cesaris. Lauda, meanwhile, had already disposed of Tambay and then on lap 11 went by the Alfa Romeo, then simply drove up to and breezed past Prost. What was left of Alain's morale seemed to crumble as Niki simply left him in the dust and set off after Patrese in second place. Niki's teammate John Watson was disqualified on lap 18 for overtaking on the parade lap, but even the McLaren team barely noticed as everyone was riveted on Lauda's progress. By the time BBC Live coverage resumed on lap 22, he was tucked up under Patrese's rear wing and climbing all over him looking for a way past. Piquet's lead at this point was over 24 seconds from Patrese, but you wouldn't have bet against Lauda reeling him in and taking the win. Ricciardo, though, was proving a tougher nut to crack, and Lauda couldn't find a way past. Patrese was due a pit stop soon, though, and with planned stops agreed between the teams in advance, Lauda was happy to wait. Instead, though, Piquet came in Patrese's slot, 20 laps before his own planned stop. He was stationary a record 9.2 seconds and emerged still in the lead just as Patrese and Lauda hove into view behind him. In fact, of the pair chasing the lead, it was the McLaren that stopped first for fuel and tyres, but this time it was their turn for bad luck as a sticking right rear wheel nut cost precious seconds. He emerged behind Prost, but the Frenchman was next in on lap 35. He pulled into the pits, the team got to work, and then he climbed out of the car. Turbo problems, he said, and his body language was that of a defeated man. However, he could still be champion if Piquet broke down, but Nelson knew it too and dialed right back on the turbo boost, while Ferrari could also celebrate their second successive Constructors' title despite what was looking so far like a distinctly lacklustre race. Tambay had moved up to third due to the tyre stops and Prost's retirement, but fell back behind De Cesaris when he stopped himself, while Patrese had another scorching Brabham stop to retain second place. So by three-quarters distance, a cruising Piquet led Patrese, with Lauda back up to third and still charging, followed by De Cesaris, Tambay and Warwick. Tambay, however, was struggling with his turbo and made heavy weather of lapping Danny Sullivan. Soon enough, it proved terminal and he pulled off to retire. Meanwhile, Lauda was gaining on Patrese and both were reeling in Piquet, and Rosberg had overtaken Cheever for 7th. So far had Piquet dialed the boost back that soon Patrese was right on his gearbox, as Giacomelli's engine burst into flames and he steered it towards a marshal's post. Amid the smoke, Patrese took the lead from Piquet, and soon Nelson also had Lauda breathing down his neck. However, as with Patrese before him, Piquet's Brabham had the better aerodynamics and straight line speed and was able to pull away a little on the straights, and with 11 laps to go it was still Patrese, Piquet and Lauda covered by just over 3 seconds at the front, with De Cesaris a good 12 seconds behind in fourth. Lauda wasn't to be denied though, and pulled past Piquet into second on lap 69 of 77. As the Brazilian fell back, Lauda was now reeling in Patrese and hoping to pressure him into a mistake like he'd made at Imola. However, on lap 72, it was all too much for the McLaren's electronics and he pulled bitterly over. So Piquet was back up into second, but now had De Cesaris bearing down on him. All Patrese had to do was keep the car running to take his second career win, but of course we've all heard that one before. With 2 laps to go, De Cesaris was only 2 seconds behind Piquet and stormed past in the dying stages as Piquet allowed him through, securing the knowledge that he only needed 3 points to seal the title. Riccardo Patrese kept it on the road to take the win, a much-deserved reward for a deeply frustrating season, with Andrea De Cesaris second after one of the best drives of his career. But in third place came Nelson Piquet to claim his second world title, to the delight of the Brabham team gathered on the track. Derek Warwick kept up Tolman's end-of-season streak, scoring fourth in what was rumoured to be his last race for the team before moving on to greater things. Rosberg brought the new Williams-Honda combination home in the points in its first race, and a philosophical Cheever picked up the last point in his last race for Renault. Kenny Aitchison did all that he could be expected to do and brought his Ram home, the last classified runner and 6 laps down, but a finish is a finish, while Mansell and Boesel were both still running at the end, but 9 and 11 laps down respectively after repeated technical problems, and neither were classified. A couple of days after the Kyalami race, Alain Prost gave an interview in which he expressed his frustration with the way the season had panned out, and laid the blame primarily at the door of the Renault team, who he said had failed to develop the RE40 chassis after the mid-season, allowing the other teams to catch up. It was hard to disagree with his assessment, but that didn't stop the team from sacking him the next day. So where would Prost be for 1984, and could Renault still challenge without their talisman? Only time would tell. In the meantime, Nelson Piquet and the Brabham team would party in designer Gordon Murray's native South Africa, there would be mixed feelings at Ferrari and a downright gloomy atmosphere at Renault, and optimism for McLaren and Williams.